Okay, Connor, why don't you start by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about you? Okay, Connor, why don't you start by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
This is Connor F. Schmid. F is for Francis, like my grandfather Frank Schmid of Avon, Minnesota. And I am a grandson or great-grandson of Joseph Schmid Sr., who had the 1856 farmstead on the southwest shores of Lake Minnetonka, the largest lake to the west, immediate west of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I will be 87 years old on September 10th of this year, and I am the son of Pat and Harry Schmid, the only child, but I had no siblings, no brothers, no sisters, but I had dozens of cousins who in another time I will tell you about, who have taken care of me from Washington, D.C. to Tokyo, Japan, and Korea. I have been extremely lucky. I went to high school in off a hobby farm near North St. Paul, a very small town in those days, helping my father and mother on this hobby farm with a little acreage and raising a bunch of produce in addition to living in that area, while my father was the director of vocational education for the state of Minnesota for some 17 years, and an expert who served overseas on a couple of occasions for the government and who testified before Congress on numerous occasions. But we were a very close family. It wasn't mom and pop. It was Mary and Harry and Connor, and it was like we were co-equals, much to the surprise of other people who used mom and pop and father and mother. But with me, it was Mary or Harry, and I was extremely lucky in my parents, who met up in Stearns County, which is part of the area near St. Cloud, Minnesota, about 60 miles to the northwest of the Twin City area. My father was the 10th son of 13 children born to Frank Schmid and his wife Gertrude Voss was her maiden name, Schmid. She was raised in Hollingford, about 10, 15 miles north of Avon. Avon being on the railroad line and the principal highway, both heading to the northwest to Fergus Falls and on up to Fargo, Minnesota, Fargo, North Dakota, Fargo-Moorhead, North Dakota. Pat and my mother, Mary, or Mary Pat, or Pat in her later years, met Harry somehow at Avon, Minnesota, which was the town adjacent to which Frank Schmid had a farm after, just before the 1900s, picking up the general store in Avon, Minnesota, a town of 200 to 300 people over the various years, and from which maybe 25 years later he moved to a farm which became a kind of a show place just outside of Avon on the north side of the town, maybe half a mile out. My Harry, as I say, was the son of the farmer. He was one of the 9 brothers. He was the tallest, in my opinion, the best looking. But he was kind of a charming guy, and for some reason had a head of hair that was like a haystack. It was curly, probably due to a childhood disease he had, which left him with a bad mitral valve that didn't interfere with his captaining the basketball team in his 2-year teacher's college at St. Cloud, Minnesota, nor being a standout end on the football team. the days when they played football almost without helmets. But my mother was the daughter of a railroad engineer that once had been at Melrose, Minnesota, which is several towns northwest of Avon on that main highway and the railroad line near Sauk Center, Minnesota. And they both were in college in about 1928, and they had met on a double date. My father was taking out a girl from the Avon area by the name of Henauer, and a very attractive lady. And my mother, on the double date, was with George Fisher, who was from Avon, Minnesota, and who played with several of the big league baseball teams. He was a tremendous hitter, and he's written up in a book called Among the Lakes and Wooded Hills, which is the story of Avon, Minnesota, a very, about 300 or 400 book filled with stories from the many Schmid children of the 9 brothers and 3 sisters, or the 10 brothers, I guess, and 3 sisters of Frank and Gertrude Schmid of Avon. But anyway, somehow George Fisher, after his several years with the major leagues as a hitter, and he was somewhat successful to the extent I don't know, but he certainly was recognized and had tryouts and played with, I think, at least a couple of the major baseball team, professional baseball teams. My father going to school at the same time as my mother. My father married George's Fisher's date, and George Fisher married Harry's date after he got back with his playing with the major leagues in St. Louis and Kansas City and where else. But anyway, my mother was the daughter of a railroad engineer who first was at Melrose, Minnesota, up the line from Avon by 2 or 3 small towns. And that railroad engineer moved into St. Cloud when the railroad moved its principal division headquarters to St. Cloud, to the roundhouse and repair place. So she was at the time a St. Cloud girl, and the 2 of them decided to get married in about 1929, and they came to Minneapolis. Were married in Minneapolis at the Basilica, which the principal cathedral being in St. Paul, where a fellow by the name of John Ireland, with an Irish background, of course, had his cathedral. They were married at the Basilica with just 2 attendants. One was the daughter of the Sears bottling company in Melrose, Minnesota, which was a booming small town industry, and the other one was the son of, I think, another businessman in the Melrose area. So that my father and mother were married in the Basilica with just the 2 attendants, which avoided in the 1929s the expenses in the heart of the Depression, and I was born on September 10th, 1930. I've had a very fortunate background. My motto, after looking at life after law school and a number of activities, have developed the motto: it's better to be lucky than to be smart. I had a good ranking in the law school, but was not outstanding. Actually got one of the poorest marks I ever got from one instructor in my first year, which ordinarily would have flunked you out. He had a speech impediment, and I could not identify with him, and so I had a bad grade from him. And then we had a brilliant young fellow who in my latter years gave me the worst mark I ever had. that was before he called me into his office and said that a Minnesota Supreme Court justice was looking for a law clerk, and would I be interested? Be careful with that. That hurts. And so I was able to clerk for 8 months for Minnesota Supreme Court justice, and that was after being able to clerk for the summer before graduation and the summer after graduation in Washington, D.C., just because one of my cousins, the eldest son of the eldest of my father's brothers, was down in Washington, D.C., and working for the Bureau of the Budget after having graduated from law school after, as he told me, having been removed from several schools for deportment of one sort or another. But he was a tough guy that would testify before Congress, and he was aware, because he had been taken from the Bureau of the Budget and drafted by the other political party to come in and be their representative to Congress on questions of Department of Justice budgets. And he was aware that one of the principals and the assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of the Civil Division was wanting to develop some career students by bringing in law clerks early and getting them started to replace a lot of the dead wood in the very much behind the records. So I was that clerk, the one of at least two clerks. I don't know, there may have been others. So I had that break from one of my cousins, Bernard Schmid, who subsequently became the managing director of the ICC at the time of deregulation, and I would spend my summer Sundays having Sunday dinner with him and cutting the lawn. But that was another lucky thing. But let's go back to my parents, in which I was extremely fortunate. My father never swore. He was an outstanding athlete despite a bad mitral valve from early childhood disease, probably scarlet fever, which may well have been the trauma that turned his hair curly. And he just was a great guy to work for, except he would do things fast. He was a very powerful guy and well muscled for a farm boy, and he would always say, "Get a hold of the other end and let's move this and move that." And I would say, "Where to?" And I was somewhat in awe of my father, as I should have been. He was a terrific guy. My mother worked in the dime store, so in a way, I could say my father found $1 million baby in a 5 and dime cent store. But anyway, the two of them married. They had the one child, and my father was kind of drafted as one of the new conservative governors, youngest governors ever, Harold Stassen, who worked on the United Nations Charter later in his life and was a somewhat humorous candidate for president out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he practiced law. But Harry was brought down from the St. Cloud area where he coached a team and taught vocational industrial arts at a little suburb of St. Cloud. And in my they lived in southeast Minneapolis near the university, and at about age 6, I began to spend my summers at the farm at Avon, Minnesota. At that time, my grandfather, Frank Schmid's farm, and I worked there each summer until about 1944, at which time my father had acquired a hobby farm right outside North St. Paul, which was a small town at that time. And again, I had a very fortunate experience being in a small town with a class of 60 where they needed bodies to do everything. I had to learn to play tackle football and basketball, even though my father continued to be a referee as well as teaching at one of the tough Minneapolis vocational schools. But for the summers, from about age 6, before my September birthday, in about 1937, I would take me to the farm where I would spend the farm, which took me out of the polio epidemic, which was then rampant in the Twin City area, and hit many of my subsequent high school colleagues, leaving them injured to one extent or another. But I enjoyed the farm, which was a great experience, a lot of hard work. Grandpa Frank Schmid was about the third or fourth child of Joseph Schmid Sr., who had come from Germany in 1830, having had a birthday on March 17th of 1830, and when he was 18 years old, he came to this country as a young man and worked in a brickyard in New York, and then he worked on steamboats or paddle boats out of New Orleans, which undoubtedly brought him up to the Minneapolis area. And about that time, in the mid-1850s, the Sioux Nation entered into treaties which opened land to the west of Minneapolis, and he established a homestead in 1856 out on Lake Minnetonka. But anyway, on the farm I would go up. He was a tough taskmaster, and as that book, Among the Lakes and Woodlands, indicated, he was involved in the general store from about 1900 on the Showplace farm outside, starting in about 1926, I understand. He had the lumber yard, he had the grain elevator, the potato warehouse. He was a substantial holder and developer of the bank at Avon. Used to take his bicycle, I understand, with a little bulldog revolver in his pocket, and take some of the major bank receipts from the store and or the bank into St. Cloud to the major bank. He was a tough guy, not very big, but strong. One of the stories was that on a bet he picked up a keg of nails, which is a substantial, small keg of nails, and put it up over his head on a bet, but had to have somebody take it out of his hands because he couldn't drop it. But he was a very thoughtful, industrious guy, and he worked those 9 brothers sufficiently, and they all took over managing various parts of the businesses that he developed. But he was the boss and called all the signals for the various things. And he married Gertrude Voss. The Voss family had settled in this holding fort about 10, 15 miles north of Avon, and she was Holland Dutch from the Low Countries, and he was, of course, from the province of Württemberg, which is a small German principality that is just on the north side of a lake called the Obensee, and I don't have the name of the lake in mind right now, but that lake separated Switzerland from this little toe of Germany, which was quite near the Black Forest, the edge of the Black Forest, the easterly edge of the Black Forest, and not too far from Alsace-Lorraine portion of Germany and France that was mixed. But anyway, he left the area in where he grew up. His father had the farm, and went to Albany, Minnesota, which was about 3 towns north of St. Cloud as you proceeded northwest. had a saloon there, then went into the general store at Avon, Minnesota, and where he raised a lot of kids, the store having a second floor which was probably a large dormitory for his growing family, and then he moved out to this farm. And it was on the farm that I first met my grandparents, Frank Schmid and Gertrude Schmid. It's kind of interesting. One of Frank's sisters, I think, married a Voss, which was a common situation in Stearns County and among the early German immigrants, is you often married somebody that was related to you by marriage or that you knew very well. So there was that kind of double relationship. But when I went up to the farm at about 6, before my 7th birthday, I was sort of added on to a family of 5 orphans, the children of the youngest daughter, who had died shortly after childbirth of her youngest daughter, Ella, or baby Ella, or Babe. And I was a couple years younger than Babe. But she was my buddy, and her slightly older brother was very close to me also, Alfred Ross, who retired as a lieutenant colonel after having participated as an infantryman in the Battle of the Bulge and picked up a Purple Heart from a machine gun bullet swimming across the river in those very dismal days. But anyway, I worked with Babe, and I assisted Alfie, who was handling the dairy aspect of the farm that Frank Schmid was on, and became a chief bottle washer and floor mopper and so on, and I worked there. Also had the job of cleaning the chicken barn, which was a nasty job that one of my older cousins from town, who helped out on the farm occasionally, was happy to see me available to take care of that during the summers. Grandma Schmid was awfully good to me. She used to say that she would let no drop of water fall on little Connor's head, was one thing I recall. She had her own business. Frank had his businesses. She did the egg thing and had a substantial production of white leghorn chickens, and would send cases of eggs up to the next town where there was a distributor of eggs or a hatchery or something like that. Frank would have the Ross kids, who after their parents died were added on to the farm situation. They were taken in and treated just like the sons and daughters of Frank and Gertrude. And we would separate out the cream and skim milk would go to the store. I don't know if any was sold to the creamery in any of the towns. At one time there was a creamery in Avon, which of course at some point Frank Schmid had helped develop according to to this book about the woodlands, among the lakes and woodlands. I worked ultimately as I got a little bit older. At first I used to have to run the length of this long barn with a big steel hook on the end of a very thick rope that was used to pull hay up into the upper part of the barn, taken from the hay racks, which the hay was put on slings, and then the slings were hooked to one end of this long rope, and then a tractor would hook the rope on and pull the rope the length of the barn. And after a while, probably when I got to be about 10 or so, I was allowed to drive the John Deere tractor, which Grandpa Schmid used to drive, and so I had some interaction with him, and he was supervising. When he got off the tractor, he was supervising, but he worked in the field, driving tractor and watching his crops and so on.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you, Connor, did your grandpa Frank work much on the farm? But apparently now what you're saying is he did a little bit. He
did. He would drive tractor. There would be corn cultivating first with horse drawn. Would be one horse and a cultivator that you would sit on. You'd have to be careful because if you weren't careful, you would cultivate the corn right out. And he was very particular about that. During threshing, during the years that I was there, from about age 7 to age 14, he was very active in the threshing time. Would drive a tractor with the wagons on it, but he would do a lot of supervising. But he would work hard, and he expected his troops to work hard too. He was known occasionally to put his boot to the seat of the pants of any slow or delinquent worker. Fortunately, that's an experience I never had. But one of the best compliments I ever had was when I was about 14 and starting, or 15, and starting to help my father on the hobby farm where we raised whitehorn chickens and white Peking ducks and eggs and a couple of pigs, a couple of turkeys, being on a kind of a hobby farm. When my grandpa Frank Schmid called up and called my dad and said, "I need Cooner. It's threshing time." He called me Cooner. Anyway, that he would think I was worth getting back up there to help at threshing time was a supreme compliment in my book. Let's see, my grandma Voss was a very gentle lady, and but she was a good businessman, and she was tough. There's some stories about one of them in this book. Lee Schmid, the son of the second oldest, I believe, of the 9 brothers, saw Grandma with a handful of lettuce walking from the house down toward the chicken thing, and he thought the lettuce looked good and asked if he could have some of that, to which the book that I was reading, or this history summary that I was reading, Grandma replied, "Can you lay eggs?" They had a very nice lawn at the farm, quite a large spread of lawn, and Alfred and I used to cut the lawn. Sometimes they would help. Sometimes we would hitch a rope on the front of the lawnmower to be the horse ahead of this hand reel type lawnmower, and we used to fuss about having to save every blade of grass to take down to the chickens. We didn't like that extra work of emptying the grass clipping baskets, and hauling them down to the chickens. But Grandma ran a good ship, and she made. I think she did well, and that was her business. Grandpa Frank made all the breakfast. He could fry an egg into a nice leathery device, but there were lots of them, and there was lots of bacon and oatmeal. But he made the breakfast on the stove that was usually fired with corn cob, so that had been doused with kerosene. So there was always a good smell of a little kerosene around the breakfast table. But Grandma did all the other meals, both when she was had her crew of the younger children still helping on the farm. would make the lunch and the dinner, and for the threshing crew, she with the assistance of some other ladies would lay out lots of good food for the hardworking men. She made wine. She made pickles. She made sauerkraut. She had a great big Red Wing crock that probably held, I would say, 20 gallons, 30 gallons, and I can remember that one of the first sprees that I ever was on, Alfred and I were helping Grandma siphon the finished wild grape or natural grape juice, which had turned into a very nice wine, red wine. We would help Grandma by starting the siphon and then putting the siphon into bottles. And we used to have a hard time starting the siphon. So both Alfred and I were practically spinning. And of course, Grandma would laugh and swat us, make us stop siphoning. That was one of the things. But she was a good cook and a generous provider. She used to say rosary, which some of the younger Ross kids were, by the time I was at the farm, participated in. And Babe and I were always there in the kitchen as Grandma led the rosary. Babe told me just a few minutes ago, and I wanted to affirm the times that I was at the farm, was that the two older brothers, Alfred and Leroy, would say the rosary from the bathroom, which had a window which they wouldn't escape out of, so they would be gone. There are other stories about the fellows at the farm, particularly Donald Schmid is one, which I won't repeat for this little thing, but it's a classic, and he told it at one of the 50 or 60-year reunions, which got a great laugh from all attending. Let's see.
I was going to ask you. Did Frank or Gertrude did either of them have any bit of German or Dutch accents or not?
Oh yes. The German was spoken quite a bit on the farm. I wouldn't say Frank had an accent, nor did Grandma, but they could speak German fluently. Mm-hmm. And they used to talk about High German and Low German. I didn't really know what that meant, but from the farm hands I learned some words that Grandma and Grandpa did not include in their vocabulary. Mm-hmm. But they both spoke English well. Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have to milk cows?
Oh yes, and I was not a good cow milker. For some reason my hands ached. The palm of my hands ached. I was always soaking them in wintergreen, and they hurt when I used the pitchfork. And toward the end of my tenure on the farm, they started using milking machines. But I would milk cows occasionally, but I just couldn't do it the way the older Ross kids who were still on the farm could. And he had quite a herd of cattle. He had, of course, being near Switzerland and having a name which in Switzerland was pronounced Schmid, spelled the same way but pronounced Schmid, and which runs a series of hostels currently in Switzerland. But anyway, the cow brand that he had was Brown Swiss, which was a neat combination. It was a good milk producer, maybe not as much as Holstein, but it was a better beef cow than that. And of course, Brown Swiss would have been the predominant popular breed in this province of Württemberg that Joseph Schmid Sr. came from in 1948, and before coming to the United States and having his work experiences here, and ultimately locating this new land, which I think he was the second owner. The first guy was a speculator that bought up property from the U.S. and then sold it off in chunks. The chickens were all white leghorns, which was a good breed. They had good springers, laid nice size eggs, were a good eating chicken, and looked very good on the farm, which had a white farm buildings. It had a barn, a chicken shed, a pig barn, a granary. Attached to the granary was a tool shed where on rainy days we would go in and sharpen tools. We always looked forward to rainy days because you didn't have to work in the field. Now, the younger people like myself and Alfie and Babe worked in a garden that Grandma had right by the house where she raised a lot of her own fruits and vegetables for her, I will think, for her own use. I don't think she was producing much for the store other than the eggs and the dairy, the creamy dairy products, which over there you'll find a black case with checks in it. It's a let's see the.
Did they have dogs?
There was a hand called. Go ahead.
Were there dogs and cats running around?
Oh, yes, yeah. There were black and white cats. They had several of them to handle the mice in the barn and other places. But I can remember the cats used to come into the kitchen and lie under this stove, which would get pretty hot with these corn cobs. And occasionally the cats they were black and white, very nice-looking cats, but they would get scorched brown under the stove, when it got too hot. One of the things was that I thought was interesting was Frank Schmid they always had a farm dog, which was probably part German Shepherd, and at one point the dog was called Jack, and another time it was called Shep. But the dog was trained so that when Frank Schmid called to Jack, he would open the the trunk of this big Studebaker that had, he said it was, according to this book that I looked at, The History of Avon, the biggest Studebaker that you could get, and it had a middle row of seats that flipped up. So he had all these kids, so there was the driver and passenger in the front, and there was a thing in the back, and then there was this row of tip-up seats between the front and the back. So he had this really nice Studebaker, and he would he'd call the dog and open the trunk. The dog would jump up into the trunk. He'd shut the trunk door, and he would go out to a pasture that was out about half a mile, but which connected with part of his farm, and you let the dog out. The dog would go out into this other pasture, round up the cows and stuff, bring them back to the road so they could cross the road while Frank was watching the road, and get on the part that they could go up to the barn. They could go up to the barn at milking time, and of course they were all cows. There were no bulls out in the pasture, and the cows, of course, were happy to be milked. So it worked pretty well. But I thought that was great that the dog would jump into the trunk, no problems. And Grandpa Schmid was a little bit of a tease, and I won't recount the time when I sort of lost my temper, some teasing that he was doing. Almost every Friday he would call Babe and he would call me and he'd say, Cooter, get some grubs. And I would get white grub worms from the pile, particularly the straw from the horse stalls. And there were these white grub worms, which were more popular even than angleworms. And we would go out on Friday about just a little afternoon to a little lake out near Collegeville or St. John's University, where there was a big Watab lake. Near it, connected by a stream, was a small Watab lake, W-A-T-A-B, that was totally within a second farm that Frank Schmid owned. And so he had his own private lake, and Babe and I and Grandpa Schmid would, in a short order, come back with a gunny sack full of good-sized sunfish and a few crappies, and we would have fresh fish on Friday night at home, and that was kind of a regular thing, the weather permitting. But there was no question. When we went to Watab Lake, we would be coming back with a gunny sack full of fresh fish. He used to sit on the porch of the wraparound porch on this big farmhouse, and he would sit there, and you could see he was thinking, and he'd sit there and think, and then he'd get up and get in the car, and he'd go and inspect any one of the 6 or 7 different businesses that he had either started or was partnering in. And he was a very smart guy. Remember, he used to show me he had an elk's tooth. He belonged to the ancient order of elks or something like that, and he had one on his watch chain. And one time, much to my surprise, he showed me how he could whistle through one hollow tooth in his mouth just by blowing something. But I mean, he was a neat guy, and he gave me a black sealskin cap that he had that had a little visor on the front, and it was a box type hat. You know, it was like a round box with a flat top on it. And I said, Grandpa, gee, by this time I was starting to go to high school. It was in about the 44. I said, oh, gee, that's too nice a hat for me to have. And he said, no, take it. It makes my head sweat. He did not have a whole lot of hair on his head. He was not a tall man or an imposing figure, but he was tough, and he was smart, and he was always thinking. You could tell that he was had some thought in mind to improve this or improve that or improve the other thing. His youngest son, Alois, went to the University of Minnesota and got a degree in agronomy, which is grains like wheat and so on, and there was an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. So he would have some new ideas, which Frank would incorporate into his farming operation in the years up until his passing with the train accident. I guess that's it was just a great experience. I learned to swim in the lake, which was in town, and the lake and the town, by the way, is really, in my book, Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon. It just matches everything.
And Spunk Lake. You're talking about Spunk Lake that you swam
Spunk Lake, middle Spunk Lake. There was upper, middle, and lower, and the middle was right in the town, and very early, undoubtedly with Grandpa Schmid's assistance, and he was the mayor for many years. And they had a town band. They had a baseball team. I don't know that he played in the baseball team. He had plenty of sons to do that. But he played a bass drum, as I understand it, which all it required was keeping the beat and a good strong arm. I never saw him play the drum, but that was the story.
You remember, it seems like in the Clancy book, there was a picture of a parade, maybe 4th of July, and there was a float in there Schmid Store float. Do you remember that parade?
No, I don't remember the parade, but 4th of July was the big celebration in Avon. There was always a baseball game with one of the other towns, and the town baseball teams were really quite high profile. When I found a nursing home for my mother after my dad died fairly early in his late 70s, and she lived on into her mid-90s, at the really nice place not too far from where we live in Edina, Minnesota, southwest suburb of Minneapolis. The social worker or the guy that handled new people coming in told me all about the Avon baseball team and how good it was. And he was from another small town and had seen it. Once, well, I'm getting into a story about Harry, but Harry used to catch for his third oldest brother, George Schmid, who was a pitcher, and Harry would have his back to a livery stable that was behind this 2-story general store that's shown in several times in the Clancy book. And my dad would say that if Harry, with a big catcher's mitt, missed catching the ball, or it was a wild pitch, and that ball hit the very thin, or just the regular rough siding on the livery stable, that the baseball would shatter and break the siding on the livery stable.
Did you spend much time in the store? Do you remember much about the store?
Yes. Every year, I would wear my farm shoes out because farm shoes are subject to a lot of abuse and toxic substances. If you're engaged in cleaning chicken coops and cleaning out the barn gutters and so on. But every year I'd go to the store, which had a wonderful smell of new leather shoes and new denim clothes, and they would buy me a pair of shoes because I'd come up in tennis shoes or moccasins or something, and I would get a pair of work shoes, and I think they also would buy me kind of a light golf jacket, because at night, by the time I came home from swimming, which I did every night because that's the way you got the dust off and got clean and so on. But the jacket, I always felt kind of dressed up in a fairly nice light jacket of the golf type.
I bet.
And now in the back of the store was the meat market part, and they used to have big sausages hanging up there, and occasionally Frankie, who used to work at the store, one of the younger brothers, who helped George. George was the one that did all the accounting and lived up above the store. Frankie would whack me off one of these big hanging sausages, hung from a string, and sometimes there would be some bananas that were getting somewhat aged and so on. So I would, they'd give me stuff at the store like that. But I didn't work in the store. But I would get the shoes and occasionally maybe a pair of overalls and that nice jacket, which I was proud of. I guess I probably wore the jacket a couple of years, but I was always impressed with that. They were all the brothers and then their kids, the dozens of cousins, were always pretty good to me. So Lee, Ed, the second or third oldest brother, and Lee was about the third of his children. He worked out at the farm. He was another one of these really muscled up, rangy farm guys. He used to call me Popcorn, and I said, "Why did you call me give me a nickname of Popcorn. And he said in the newspapers, the funny papers, there was that old black gentleman who had white hair, and his nickname was Snowball, and Lee couldn't remember Snowball, so he said Popcorn. He called me Popcorn, and, which was easier than Snowball.
Mm-hmm.
Also, up at the farm, they used to have these crisscross joke books put out by a publishing company with all kinds of corny jokes in them, and that used to be one of the things we read.
Did you all have a telephone at the farm?
Yes, there was a telephone at the farm, and the one I remember was one of these black ones that just stood up straight, and had a receiver that you hung on a hook on the side.
Mm-hmm. And wasn't the telephone operator upstairs at the store?
Well, over the store, according to the Clancy book that you mentioned, among the lakes and wooded hills, the phones were brought in by Frank Schmid. The initial switchboard was up above the store, and often run by. Thank you, Camille. Run by usually family members. I guess my dad, in the original ones, it was all a plug-in deal.
Mm-hmm.
You had a bunch of things that you plugged in. Ultimately, it moved out and was run by a telephone company. But the phone, the one phone that I remembered in the farm was in the front hallway. Nobody came in the front door, but there was a desk near it, and the phone was there, and occasionally it would ring and we'd answer it, and some wiseacre would call and say, "Do you have Prince Albert in the can?" And we say yes or no, and they say, "Well, he's tired, let him out." Being a farmer's joke, of course.
No,
I think I've identified a phone that I think may have been in the kitchen, an old-fashioned one in an oak wooden case, and I think it has a ringer on the side. At one point, you used to turn a crank to ring the phone. I was talking to Babe, who's one of my closest cousins, who considers me like a little brother. And on my 19th birthday, Mr. Lucky, me, had the honor of being the best man at her wedding, her brothers all being away in the service or somewhere else, and that was on my birthday, and I was just so proud to be that. And she, in recent years, she referred to me in one of her Christmas notes as she'd always thought of me as a little brother, which I thought was extremely nice.
Nice.
The Ross kids were all bright and just terrific guys. Two of them retired as lieutenant colonels. They were both of them were aeronautical engineers. The oldest one lived with my folks, roomed and went to the University of Minnesota, got a degree in chemical engineering, and went to from University of Minnesota to Eastman Kodak in New York, which was quite something in those days. And I'm getting into the dozens of cousins who are just fabulous people.
Actually, you've given me so many ideas, and then we'll segue into the next interview we'll do. We'll wrap this one up, but the next one I want to go into when you were going to the farm, and I think you said the last year was 1944. So what I want to hear from you next on another call is about the Schmids who went into the services. So we'll talk about that.
Oh, yeah, they're terrific.
We'll talk about that. So
I want to mention one thing about my dad. My dad was a little beyond the service age, but he was, in addition to, at that time, being the director of vocational education for the state, a job which he held 17 years, he was made the director of war production training here in Minnesota, which was an additional job that he did. And he was, and I'll mention, he was a colonel in the Civil Air Patrol and so on. And about my mother and father, at 40, my father learned to fly light planes, both land single engine and float single engine, and did some remarkable flying. There's some terrific stories about my father that almost should be a separate chapter that we can talk about later. Well, one of the other lucky things was when I went through ROTC, as did some of my Ross cousins who had stayed with my folks, roomed there while they went to the university. So I knew them, but I went through ROTC and got a commission and was stationed near San Francisco for about 8 months, and then a year in Korea after the shooting. But while I was over there, one of my law clerk friends told me about a federal judge who was looking for a law clerk, and so I wrote the federal judge, and he wrote back and said, "Dear Connor, I've hired a clerk, but the U.S. attorney is looking for some people to add to his staff," and he suggested I write him, and so I wrote, and I was fortunate enough to be employed as an assistant U.S. attorney, reading FBI reports and doing some criminal prosecutions and some civil work, which was another lucky break for me. And as I look back and think about some of the people I put away and some of the cases I had, was very interesting. And then subsequent to that, and another time I'll tell you, the third chapter is Trials and Tribulations, when I'll tell you about some of the funny things or interesting things that happened to me. The second volume of the trilogy is Dozens of Cousins, which will fill a number of pages and just be heartwarming as to all of the good things that those many cousins of mine who treated me just like one of their own, or maybe even better, over the years. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I just thought that I would, when we wrap this up, I do want to give the date. Today is Sunday, the 13th of August in 2017.
Correct.
And we're talking to Connor Schmid. What's your middle name? Do you have a middle name?
Excuse me.
I've got you all choked up.
Yeah. In a way, there are times when, thinking back to the kindnesses and the good fortune I've had, I do sort of get choked up a little bit. There's a little more on the background of Frank Schmid's father was drafted with his younger brother Benedict. Joseph Sr. was 34 years old when he was drafted for the last year of the Civil War, and the two brothers got to the 2nd Minnesota Volunteers north of Atlanta about the same time that Kathy's great-grandfather, who was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner at about age 16 or 17, lost his arm and had his hand shattered in a accident guarding prisoners. But they either overlapped or were just 1 week apart and had the same guard duty. We're in different companies of the Minnesota 2nd.
Interesting.
But when Joseph Sr. got back from the war, Frank was born a respectable time after the end of the Civil War. There's no doubt that he was a proper son, and the farm was looked after by his wife. I think her name was Elizabeth Schweikart, her maiden name, something like that.
Yes,
and she was at home with a 6-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old Joe Jr. and maybe a babe in arms. And the
5 children
uprising had just been 2 years before that, so they were really an Indian country, being west of Minnetonka, which was a sacred lake. But by that time they'd hung a number of the Indians and put down with some difficulty, put down the Sioux uprising, which took 300 or 400 of the farmers.
I know it was a wild territory. What year did it become a state?
In 1858, 2 years after the homestead was established. I intend to do some further looking into the records, and I should have a chance to do that. The first record I looked at showed that Benedict took out the first papers on the farm and then immediately turned it over to Frank, because Frank was still working on the riverboats, trying to get enough money for a down payment on the farm, undoubtedly, while his 4-year younger brother was able to work there and would occasionally go back to Cincinnati to work for German farmers in that area to get a little money.
Right. Yeah, his diaries have been fascinating to read.
Oh,
we all need to read all the diaries of Benedict, because it tells us about what everyone was doing. And their sister Maria, and even when their mother and the man she married after their father Thomas died, when the kids were all little, she remarried. But they came over to Minnesota, and
I saw a reference, and I wasn't sure whether Benedict was talking about his wife's parents, or and I really thought it was Joseph Sr.'s parents, and Benedict's parents.
It was. I believe it was their parents, and now. I didn't know about Maria until you mentioned it at the last meeting that you had. Yeah, I was totally unaware of that. Of her. Little. Yeah, I think Joseph was 6 when Thomas died, their dad. But she remarried them the following year. Yeah. But they came over in around 1861 or something. But they didn't care for it, and I think they left. They didn't care much for Minnesota, so. But was not a good place. No, I think not a good place. we found his grave in New Jersey. We have not located Maria yet. Oh, interesting. Or Mary. Oh, you've just done a wonderful job on this. It is so interesting to me. You come up with new things every time I talk to you. Well, everybody's in it. I've had fun meeting many of the great grandchildren of Benedict. So they have a lot of information on Joseph and Benedict. So anyway, we're gonna end this interview. We're gonna do 2 or 3 more. But thank you, Connor. And thank you so much for everything that you've done. And we'll talk again soon. Very good. Signing off. Bye bye. Bye bye now.